The ship shook again, and Ambassador Kelris held on to her seat with both hands because the enemy was getting closer, and her people were dying in space, and there was nothing she could do to stop it but watch the screens and hope that somehow they would survive another hour or another day or maybe just another minute at this point, because the Krelthar ships kept coming and they never stopped hunting and they never showed mercy, and her fleet of 43 ships had been reduced to just 7 vessels limping through the darkness while the enemy circled like hungry predators, waiting for the right moment to strike the final blow that would end everything her people had worked so hard to build in this sector of space. Commander Vexen stood near the tactical display, and his skin glowed with patterns that showed he was stressed beyond anything Kelris had seen in her 30 years of knowing him, and he kept looking at the numbers on the screen as if staring at them hard enough would make them change, but the reality was simple and terrible, because they had 7 ships against an enemy fleet of at least 50 vessels, and their weapons were running low on ammunition, and their shields were failing, and soon there would be nothing left between them and the cold vacuum of death except hope and prayers to gods, who seemed to have abandoned them weeks ago when this nightmare began. A young officer named Torin approached the command area, and he looked nervous because everyone was nervous now after watching so many of their friends and family die in the attacks that had been happening for weeks, and he carried a data tablet in his shaking hands and cleared his throat twice before speaking, because what he was about to suggest went against everything the Valthine believed about peaceful cooperation and diplomatic solutions to conflicts but desperate times called for. Desperate measures, and they were well past desperate at this point in the war that was not supposed to be a war, because the Valthine did not wage wars, and that was why they were losing so badly to an enemy that understood violence in ways they never could or wanted to understand. The humans were his suggestion, and the word hung in the air like smoke from a fire because everyone knew about the humans and their reputation across the galaxy as the species from the death world called Earth, where everything tried to kill you, from the moment you were born until the moment you died, and somehow they had not only survived but thrived and built ships and weapons that made other species nervous because humans fought differently than everyone else, and they did not seem to understand the concept of acceptable losses or proportional response or any of the civilized rules of engagement that the rest of the galaxy had agreed upon centuries ago, when war became something that was managed and controlled rather than something wild and destructive. Kelris had read the reports about Earth and how it was classified as a Class 12 death world, which was the highest danger rating any planet could receive, and it meant that the gravity was crushing and the atmosphere was toxic and the weather patterns were violent and the native life forms were aggressive, and somehow humans had evolved in that nightmare environment and developed technology and reached for the stars while carrying with them all the survival instincts and aggressive tendencies that came from living on a world that actively tried to exterminate you every single day, and that made them dangerous in ways that most species could not comprehend, because most species evolved on nice, peaceful worlds where the biggest threat was maybe a thunderstorm or a large herbivore that might step on you by accident. Vexen shook his head and said that calling the humans would be like inviting a bigger monster to fight their current monster, and Kelris understood his concern, because the humans were known for their excessive use of force and their willingness to fight at odds that would make any sane military commander surrender immediately, and they carried backup weapons to their backup weapons and wore armor that could survive temperatures that would cook a Valthine alive, and their military doctrine included phrases like acceptable casualties and total war, and scorched earth policy and all sorts of other concepts that made peaceful species feel physically ill when they read about them in the history files. But Kelris also knew that the Krelthar had killed 20,000 colonists in their first attack and had been systematically hunting down the survivors ever since, and showed no interest in negotiation or mercy or any of the civilized behaviors that were supposed to govern conflicts between spacefaring species. And maybe that meant it was time to stop being civilized and start being practical, because right now practical meant surviving, and surviving meant getting help from the only species in the galaxy that seemed to actually enjoy fighting and was good at it and had a track record of winning battles against impossible odds through sheer stubborn refusal to give up or die quietly. She gave the order to send the distress call, and Torin rushed to his station to begin broadcasting on the frequencies that the human ships monitored, and Kelris sat back in her chair and wondered if she had just made the best decision of her life, or the worst decision of her life, because there was no middle ground when it came to calling the Deathworlders for help. since they would either save you or make things so much worse that you would wish you had just surrendered to your original enemy and taken your chances with them instead of unleashing human military forces on the situation. The message went out into the darkness of space and traveled faster than light through subspace channels and reached its destination in the Kepler corridor, where a human destroyer called the Vengeful Spirit was conducting routine patrols, and the ship received the distress call, and the communications officer called out to his commander that they had a situation, and Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison set down his coffee and walked over to read the message on the screen, and his jaw tightened as he processed the information about Valthene refugees being hunted by Krelthar forces. Morrison was a career officer who had joined the Navy at 18 and spent the last 12 years learning how to fight in space and how to command a warship and how to make the hard decisions that came with being responsible for the lives of his crew and the success of his missions, and right now he was facing a decision that could get him court-martialed, because technically, he was supposed to wait for authorization from command before responding to distress calls from non-treaty allies, but technically did not save lives and technically did not stop genocides, and technically was the kind of word that let good people stand by and do nothing while bad things happen to innocent civilians. He thought about the unofficial motto of the Terran Coalition Navy, which was better to ask forgiveness than permission, and he thought about his little sister who worked on a research station studying alien cultures and how he would want someone to help her if she was ever in danger. And he thought about the 20,000 dead colonists mentioned in the distress call and how their deaths could have been prevented if someone had acted sooner and faster and with more force. And he made his decision in about 3 seconds, because some decisions did not require long deliberation when the right choice was obvious, even if it was not the safe choice or the approved choice or the choice that would make his superiors happy. He ordered battle stations, and the alarm started blaring throughout the ship, and his crew scrambled to their positions because they were trained for this and they were ready for this, and they trusted their commander to make good decisions even when those decisions involved charging into combat against unknown enemies to save aliens they had never met, because that was what humans did, and that was what made them different from most other species in the galaxy who preferred committees and debates and careful consideration of all possible diplomatic solutions before resorting to violence as a last resort. Sarah Kim was in her quarters when the alarm sounded, and she pulled on her uniform and grabbed her personal sidearm from the locker, because old habits from her Marine Corps days never died, and ran to the weapons control center where she took her station and began running diagnostics on all the systems that would keep them alive in the coming battle. And everything showed green, which meant the railguns were ready, and the missiles were loaded, and the main particle accelerator was charged, and the point defense systems were online, and the ship was ready to do what it was built to do, which was project human military power across vast distances and remind anyone who needed reminding that messing with humans or their friends was a very bad idea that would have very bad consequences. The Vengeful Spirit turned toward the coordinates provided in the distress call, and her fusion drives ignited with enough force to push the destroyer to speeds that would have liquefied most alien species, because humans had evolved in high gravity and could tolerate accelerations that would kill others. And that meant human ships could move faster and turn harder and fight more aggressively than almost any other vessels in space. And that gave them a tactical advantage that had won battles and saved lives and earned humanity a reputation as the species you absolutely did not want to fight, unless you had no other choice, and even then, you might want to reconsider your life choices. 8 hours of travel time meant 8 hours of preparation, and Morrison used that time to brief his crew on what they knew about the Krelthar forces and what they knew about the Valthene refuge. The Vengeful Spirit dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the battlefield and immediately began scanning the area with sensors that could detect a ship from millions of kilometers away. And what they found was exactly as bad as Morrison had expected, because the 7 Valthene ships were clustered together in a defensive position, trying to protect their slowest vessel, which was a transport full of civilian refugees, while 15 Krelthar warships circled them like sharks that had found wounded prey and were taking their time enjoying the hunt before moving in for the final kill, because that was what bullies did when they thought no one was watching and no one could stop them. Morrison watched the tactical display and felt his anger growing cold and focused in his chest, because he had seen this behavior before from pirates who enjoyed making their victims suffer And the Krelthar were doing the same thing by slowly wearing down the Valthine shields and breaking their spirits before delivering the killing blow. And that made what he was about to do feel less like combat and more like putting down a rabid animal that needed to be removed from civilized space. Permanently and with extreme prejudice, as the old military reports used to say, Lieutenant Danny Foster was studying the enemy formation and reporting that the Krelthar had positioned their ships in a loose circle about 200,000 kilometers out from the Valthine vessels, and they were maintaining some kind of field that prevented the Valthine from jumping to faster than light speeds, which meant they were trapped and slowly dying. And the Krelthar were so confident in their superiority that they had not even bothered to post any guard ships or sensor pickets to watch for additional contacts approaching the battle, which meant they thought they had already won and were just playing with their food before eating it. Sarah Kim checked her weapon systems and reported that everything was ready to fire, but they were still too far out for effective engagement and would need to close the distance to about 200,000 kilometers before she could guarantee hits on target. And Morrison told her she had 60 seconds to get her firing solutions ready because they were going in fast and hard, and the Krelthar were about to learn a very painful lesson about what happened when you attacked civilians in human-protected space, even if the Valthine were not technically under human protection yet. But they were about to be, because Morrison was declaring it so right here and right now. The helmsman Luis Martinez pushed the throttle forward, and the vengeful spirit surged ahead with her fusion drives burning bright enough to look like a small star, and they approached the battlefield from an angle where the local sun was behind them, which made them harder to spot because their heat signature blended with the background radiation from the star. And that gave them a few extra seconds of surprise, which in space combat could mean the difference between life and death, or victory and defeat, or going home to your family versus becoming another debris field floating in the endless dark. Foster sent a tight beam message to the Valthine flagship, telling them to get their ships as far away from the Krelthar as possible in exactly 3 minutes, and Ambassador Kelrus received the message and nearly fell out of her chair because the humans were actually here and they were asking for tactical coordination, and they were about to engage 15 enemy warships with just one destroyer, which seemed like suicide. But then again, humans were famous for doing things that seemed like suicide and somehow surviving through sheer stubbornness and superior firepower, and maybe this time would be no different. The Valthine ships began moving away from the Krelthar, and the enemy took this as a sign of panic and started closing in for the kill, and their weapons began charging and their shields came to full power, and they were so focused on finishing off their prey that they never noticed the vengeful spirit coming up behind them, at speeds that were frankly dangerous even by human standards, because Martinez was flying the ship right at the edge of what the engines could handle without melting down or shaking apart or doing something else catastrophic that would leave them floating dead in space. Morrison counted down the seconds in his head, and when he hit the 3-minute mark, he gave the order to fire, and Kim smiled because she had been waiting for this moment since they first received the distress call, and her fingers moved across her control panel with practiced precision, and the vengeful spirit announced her presence to the galaxy, with enough violence to make even other humans take a step back and reconsider their life choices, because the weapon systems on a human destroyer were not designed for proportional response or measured engagement, or any of the civilized concepts that governed warfare for most species. The main particle accelerator fired first and drew so much power that the lights in the ship dimmed for a moment, and the beam of accelerated particles crossed 200,000 kilometers in about 2 seconds, traveling at 30% of light speed, and hit the nearest Krelthar cruiser right in the middle section, where the reactor was located, and the shields collapsed instantly because they were designed to spread out energy weapon fire over time, not handle concentrated fury, delivered in a single devastating pulse, and the beam punched through the hull and through the reactor chamber and out the other side, and the ship exploded in a ball of plasma so bright that every sensor in the system overloaded for a second. Before the Krelthar could even process what had just happened, Kim opened up with the railguns, which were humanity's answer to the question of how to hurt something in space without using energy weapons, and the answer was simple and elegant and terrifying. Because you took pieces of metal and threw them really, really hard using magnetic accelerators that could launch tungsten penetrators at velocities that turned them into kinetic kill vehicles that hit with as much force as small nuclear weapons, and did not care about shields or armor or prayers to whatever gods the target species believed in. A second Krelthar ship took 3 penetrators in rapid succession and the first one punched through the bow armor like it was made of tissue paper, and the second one hit near the bridge section, and the third one found the ammunition storage, and the resulting detonation ripped the ship into 4 distinct pieces that tumbled through space-trailing atmosphere and debris and probably bodies. Although Morrison tried not to think about that part, because even though the enemy deserved what they were getting, he was not the kind of officer who enjoyed killing, and took satisfaction only in the knowledge that he was preventing future deaths by stopping the Krelthar here and now. The Krelthar fleet finally realized they were under attack, and their ships began to scatter, trying to identify the threat and locate the attacker. But Morrison had positioned the vengeful spirit with the sun behind them, which made them hard to spot against the background glare, and by the time the enemy sensors finally locked onto the human destroyer, it was already too late, because Kim had reloaded the main gun and fired again, and another Krelthar ship disappeared in an explosion that registered on every sensor for light years around. Foster called out that the Krelthar had finally found them and were launching missiles, and Morrison ordered the point defense systems to engage, which they did with mechanical precision, because human point defense was another example of massive over-engineering, where the designers had looked at the problem of incoming missiles and decided the solution was to create overlapping fields of rapid-fire cannons that could track and destroy hundreds of targets simultaneously. And the Krelthar missiles never got closer than 5,000 kilometers before being reduced to expanding clouds of shrapnel. Kim launched the vengeful spirit's own missile salvo, and human missiles were terrifying things because each one carried its own sensor suite and maneuvering thrusters and enough explosive power to crack open a small moon, and they spread out in a pattern designed to overwhelm enemy point defenses by coming from multiple angles simultaneously, and then converged on their targets with the kind of coordination that only advanced computer systems could achieve. And 3 more Krelthar ships vanished in fireballs that lit up the darkness of space. Foster reported that the enemy formation was breaking, and the remaining Krelthar ships were running for the edge of the gravity well where they could jump to faster than light speeds and escape. But Morrison was not about to let that happen, because if even one enemy ship made it back to report what had happened here, then the Krelthar High Command would know that humans were involved, and would probably send a bigger fleet, and that would mean more fighting and more dying, and the whole situation would escalate, when what he wanted was to send a message so clear and so brutal that the Krelthar would never come back to this sector of space again. He ordered Martinez to pursue, and the helmsman grinned because he had been holding back during the initial engagement to maintain defensive positioning. But now they were going on offense, and he could open up the throttle and show these alien ships what a human destroyer could really do when her crew stopped being cautious and started being aggressive. And the vengeful spirit leaped forward with acceleration that would have killed most species, but only made her human crew grunt and tighten their restraints because they were built for this in ways that other species simply were not. The chase lasted 15 minutes, and it was not really a chase S. Ambassador Kelris tried to compose herself before opening the communication channel to the human ship, because meeting the people who had just saved her entire species from extinction required a certain amount of diplomatic grace, even when those people had demonstrated enough destructive power to level a small continent in less than 20 minutes, and she took a deep breath and straightened her robes and hoped her voice would not shake when she spoke, because leaders were not supposed to show fear even when they were absolutely terrified of the beings they were about to talk to for the first time. Morrison appeared on the view screen, and Kelris studied him carefully, because this was her first time seeing a human up close, and he looked surprisingly normal, with his short brown hair and tired eyes that seemed to carry the weight of too many hard decisions, and she realized that whatever else humans were, they were not mindless killers, but rather soldiers, who understood the cost of violence even when violence was necessary, and that made them more frightening in some ways, because mindless killers could be predicted, but thinking killers who chose when and how to unleash destruction were far more dangerous. She thanked him for saving her people, and Morrison accepted the thanks with a simple nod, but then told her something that made her relief evaporate like water on a hot surface, because he explained that the 15 ships he had just destroyed were only a hunter group, and that somewhere nearby was a much larger Krelthar fleet, probably numbering between 50 and 200 vessels, and that meant they had won a battle but not the war, and the war was far from over because the Krelthar would send more ships and more hunters, and eventually they would find the Valthian again unless something changed dramatically and soon. Morrison asked Kelris to explain everything about how this conflict started and what the Krelthar wanted, and she told him the story of how the Valthene had established a colony in what they thought was unclaimed space, and how the Krelthar had arrived 6 months later demanding immediate evacuation, and how when the Valthene tried to negotiate, the Krelthar responded with orbital bombardment that killed 20,000 colonists in the first wave, and how the Valthene defense fleet had tried to protect the evacuation ships but were hopelessly outmatched, and how the survivors had been running and hiding ever since. When she finished, Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something about humans and their history, and their promise to never again allow genocide to happen when they had the power to stop it. And Kelrus felt a chill run through her because the way he said it made clear that this was not just a military operation or a rescue mission, but something personal, and something that humans took very seriously, and that meant the Krelthar had made a mistake far worse than they could possibly understand because they had triggered a response from a species that held grudges and remembered wrongs and did not stop fighting until the job was finished completely. Morrison explained that humans had a saying about never stopping when they faced overwhelming force, and that most species in the galaxy evolved on peaceful worlds where the rational response to superior numbers was to negotiate or retreat, but humans evolved in constant combat where retreat meant death and negotiation meant weakness, and so their instinct when facing impossible odds was to hit back harder and keep hitting until either they won or they died trying. And the rest of the galaxy called this insanity, but humans called it spite. And either way, it won battles and saved lives and made enemies reconsider their decisions. He told Kelrus that her people needed to jump to the nearest Federation station and request asylum where they would be safe, while he and his ship tracked the Krelthar back to their main fleet and introduced them to a human concept called total war, and Kelrus did not want to know what that meant, but Morrison explained anyway because he wanted her to understand that the Krelthar had crossed a line when they killed civilians and hunted refugees, and that such actions had consequences, and those consequences would be delivered with extreme prejudice by human military forces who specialized in making examples out of enemies who thought they could commit atrocities without answering for their crimes. After the communication ended, Vexen approached Kelrus and said that he thought they might have unleashed something they did not fully understand, because the humans had just destroyed 15 warships without taking damage, and were now planning to hunt down the entire Krelthar fleet with a single destroyer, which was either supreme confidence or complete insanity, and probably some mixture of both. And he had been reading human military history, which was full of stories about wars where humans bombed cities until nothing remained and dropped weapons that could destroy entire regions, and created military doctrines specifically designed to break enemy will through overwhelming violence. Vexen said that human military history before they left their planet was terrifying enough, but after they developed weapons that could crack moons and ships that could cross galaxies, the level of potential destruction they could unleash was almost beyond comprehension, and maybe asking for their help was like introducing an apex predator into an ecosystem that had been relatively peaceful for centuries, and that predator would change everything whether people wanted it changed or not, because that was what apex predators did when they entered new territory. Kelrus thought about the 20,000 colonists who died in the first Krelthar attack, and about the children aboard the refugee transport who were alive because a human warship had decided to intervene, and about whether peaceful civilizations could survive in a galaxy that still had species like the Krelthar, who believed might made right and took what they wanted through force. And she decided that maybe the galaxy did need an apex predator that would stand up to bullies and fight, back when others could not or would not fight for themselves. Aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Morrison was having a similar conversation with his senior staff, and Foster was pointing out that even with reinforcements, they would be outnumbered 10-1 or maybe 20-1 against the main Krelthar fleet, and that normally such odds would require a careful strategic withdrawal and regrouping. But Morrison was not talking about withdrawing or regrouping, but rather about hunting and attacking and making the enemy hurt badly enough that they would never come back to this sector of space regardless of how many ships they had or how many warriors they could field. Kim reported that the Krelthar had numbers, but their tactics were terrible, because they relied on overwhelming force and intimidation, and had probably never faced an opponent who actually fought back effectively. And if the humans could hit them hard enough and fast enough, they could cause a cascade failure in the Krelthar command structure, where fear and confusion would do more damage than any weapon, because armies that were afraid made mistakes, and mistakes in space combat, usually, meant death and a whole lot of expensive debris floating where warships used to be. Martinez added that there was also a psychological factor, because they had just wiped out a Krelthar hunter group in under 20 minutes, and when word got back to the main fleet, the enemy would be looking over their shoulders and jumping at. Shadows and fear was a weapon that humans understood very well, because they had used it throughout their history to win battles against superior numbers, by making the enemy believe that fighting was more dangerous than retreating, and that humans were too crazy or too violent or too stubborn to be worth engaging in prolonged combat. Morrison explained that command would send reinforcements, but they would take time to arrive, and in the meantime the vengeful spirit would hunt Krelthar supply lines and communication nodes, and any target that would disrupt enemy operations, because the goal was not to win a fair fight but to make the fight as unfair as possible, in favor of the humans and their allies. And if that meant attacking rear area targets and destroying logistics infrastructure, and generally making life miserable for the Krelthar, until they decided this sector was more trouble than it was worth, then that was exactly what they would do. Foster asked if they were really going to war, and Morrison corrected him by saying they were already at war, and the Krelthar just did not know it yet, because war did not begin when someone fired the first shot, but when someone made the decision to use violence to achieve their goals, and the Krelthar had made that decision 6 months ago, when they bombarded a civilian colony and killed 20,000 people who had done nothing except try to build a new life on a distant world. And that meant the war started then, and humans were just now arriving to finish what the Krelthar had started. Morrison stood and walked to the viewport and looked out at the debris field that had been 15 Krelthar warships an hour ago, and said that the Valthian had asked for help, and humans had given it. But this was bigger than one refugee fleet, because the Krelthar needed to learn that there were lines civilized species did not cross, and that attacking civilians was one of those lines, and that humanity would enforce that rule, even if it meant going to war against an enemy that outnumbered them, because some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds or the cost or the personal risk involved. The crew of the Vengeful Spirit understood what their commander was saying, because they were all volunteers who had joined the military, knowing that someday they might be called upon to fight. The Krelthar did not discover their hunter group was missing for 6 hours, and by then the Vengeful Spirit had already finished analyzing the debris field and extracted navigation data from the destroyed ships and begun tracking the enemy supply chain back to its source, because human intelligence officers were very good at finding patterns in data and even better at exploiting those patterns to hurt their enemies in ways that most species never thought to try, because most species fought wars with rules and honor codes, while humans fought wars with whatever worked and did not particularly care if their tactics were considered fair or sporting or gentlemanly. Morrison studied the intelligence reports and discovered that the Krelthar were operating far from their home territory, which meant they needed supply lines to keep their fleet functional, and those supply lines were vulnerable because the Krelthar had gotten arrogant after weeks of unopposed hunting and had not bothered to protect their rear areas adequately, which was exactly the kind of mistake that human military doctrine was designed to exploit. Because if you could not beat an enemy in a straight fight, then you disrupted their logistics until they could not fight effectively, and then you beat them while they were weak and confused. Foster identified 3 supply depots that the Krelthar were using to resupply their fleet, and one of those depots handled 70% of all logistics operations, which made it a prime target, because destroying it would force the enemy to either retreat back to their home territory or split their forces to protect the remaining depots, and either option would give the humans breathing room and tactical advantages that could be exploited in future engagements when reinforcements arrived and the real war began in earnest. The Vengeful Spirit set course for the primary supply depot and ran in full stealth mode, which meant minimal power to the engines and sensors operating passively instead of actively broadcasting, and the ship became a ghost drifting through space, barely visible against the background radiation of the universe, and this was exactly the kind of operation that human ships were designed for, because humans had learned during their own wars on Earth that sometimes the best way to win was to not be seen until it was too late for the enemy to do anything about it. 36 hours later, they arrived at the edge of the target system and began scanning, and what they found was better than Morrison had hoped, because the depot was a massive orbital facility that could service multiple ships simultaneously, and there were fuel tankers and ammunition barges and supply transports moving in constant streams. But the defenses were surprisingly light, with just 5 escort frigates and some automated defense platforms, because the Krelthar really had not expected anyone to be crazy enough to attack their supply infrastructure deep in what they considered their own operational territory. Morrison ordered Kim to target the escorts and defense platforms first, but to disable the depot itself, rather than destroy it, because those supplies might be useful later, and there was no point in wasting perfectly good fuel and ammunition when you could capture it instead and use it against the original owners, which was the kind of practical thinking that won wars when combined with superior firepower and crews who knew how to use that firepower with maximum efficiency and minimum wasted effort. The vengeful spirit dropped her stealth and opened fire in the same instant, and the main particle accelerator spoke first and vaporized the command frigate before its crew even knew they were under attack, and then the missiles launched and filled space with smart weapons that tracked their targets with mechanical precision and wove through point defense fire that was too little and too late to make any difference. And 4 more explosions blossomed against the black as the remaining escort frigates died without firing a single shot in their own defense, because surprise and violence of action were force multipliers that humans understood very well. The automated defense platforms tried to engage, but they were designed to fend off pirates, not military destroyers with state-of-the-art weapons, and Kim eliminated each platform systematically with her railguns punching through their armor like it was made of cardboard. And within 2 minutes, the depot was completely defenseless, and escape pods were launching as the station personnel evacuated, because they knew when they were beaten and had no interest in dying for a supply depot that was already lost. Morrison let the escape pods go because he was not interested in killing civilians or support personnel who were just doing their jobs, and his target was the military infrastructure, not individual people. And Kim fired a single precisely aimed missile that struck the main fuel storage section with surgical accuracy, and the explosion was large enough to disable the depot, but controlled enough not to destroy the entire facility, because Morrison wanted the Krelthar to see what had been done to their supply base and understand that humans could reach out and touch them anywhere, anytime, regardless of how safe they thought they were. Foster called out that they had incoming contacts and multiple ships were dropping out of faster-than-light travel, and the sensors counted 23 Krelthar warships, which was too many to engage directly. But Morrison had achieved his objective, because the depot was crippled, and more importantly, he had sent a message that the Krelthar were not safe in their rear areas anymore, and that message would spread through their fleet like a virus, making crews nervous and commanders paranoid, and that psychological damage was worth more than destroying a few more ships in a battle he might not win. Martinez jumped the ship to faster-than-light speeds, just as the Krelthar response force opened fire on empty space, and the vengeful spirit vanished into hyperspace, leaving behind a crippled supply depot and a very confused enemy fleet that was starting to realize they had a serious problem on their hands because someone was attacking their infrastructure and disrupting their operations, and that someone was very good at hitting hard and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive, which was the definition of guerrilla warfare, and something that civilized species did not usually engage in. But humans were not civilized in the way most other species understood the term. Aboard the Krelthar flagship Devourer's Pride, the fleet commander named Raxus stared at the tactical display and felt something he had not felt in many years, which was fear, because an hour ago his forces had complete superiority in this sector, and now one of his primary supply depots was crippled, and a hunter group was missing, and somewhere in the void was a single enemy warship that seemed to be operating with complete impunity and making his entire fleet look like amateurs who did not know how to fight a real war against a real opponent. His intelligence officer reported that the attacking ship was probably human in origin, based on the weapons signatures, and Raxus knew about humans because everyone in the galaxy knew about the Deathworlders who had evolved on a planet that should have been uninhabitable and somehow not only survived but thrived and built warships that were overbuilt and overarmed and crewed by warriors who fought like creatures who had spent millions of years learning to survive on a world that actively tried to kill them every single day. Raxus ordered additional hunter groups deployed to find and destroy the human ship, and also ordered the fleet to begin consolidating around the command station, because if humans were interfering, then the Krelthar needed to concentrate their forces and stop spreading out in small groups that could be picked off one by one. And his intelligence officer hesitated and pointed out that recalling the fleet would allow the Valthine survivors to escape. But Raxus was not stupid, and he understood. that the Valthine were no longer the priority threat, because a single human destroyer had done more damage in 2 engagements than the entire Valthine fleet had managed in 6 months. Over the next 72 hours, the vengeful spirit continued her campaign of harassment and struck supply convoys, and destroyed communication relays and ambushed patrol groups, and generally made life miserable for the Krelthar fleet, and each attack was calculated to inflict maximum disruption with minimum risk, because Morrison and his crew were not interested in fair fights or glorious battles, but rather in winning a war through superior tactics and better execution, and by making the enemy afraid to patrol their own space. The crew operated on minimal sleep and survived on coffee and adrenaline, and Martinez became an expert at threading through asteroid fields and hiding in the shadows of gas giants, and Kim maintained her weapons with obsessive care because a single malfunction could mean death, and Foster coordinated intelligence gathering by piecing together enemy movements from intercepted communications and sensor data, and slowly building a picture of where the Krelthar main fleet was located, and how it was organized and what its weaknesses were. Each attack drove Raxus closer to rage because his fleet was being humiliated by a single ship, and worse, his warriors were beginning to show fear, and crews started requesting transfers off frontline vessels, and patrol ships traveled in groups, instead of alone, and eventually stopped patrolling altogether, and the Krelthar fleet began contracting and consolidating for safety, rather than pursuing their original mission of hunting down Valthine survivors, which meant Morrison had achieved his strategic objective of making the enemy react to him instead of the other way around. On the 3rd day, Foster D. Raxus took the bait completely, and within hours his entire fleet was moving toward the debris field where the human ships were supposedly hiding, and he brought 87 capital ships and 300 escorts and enough firepower to destroy a small planet because he was done playing games and done being embarrassed by a single human destroyer. And he was going to crush these Deathworlders and show them that numbers still mattered, and that arrogance had consequences even for species that thought they were invincible just because they came from a harsh world. His fleet approached the debris field in tight formation with shields overlapping and weapons charged, and every sensor scanning for threats, because Raxus was angry, but not stupid, and he knew the humans would try something unexpected, because that was what they always did. But he had so many ships that it should not matter what tricks the humans tried, because sheer volume of fire would overwhelm any defense, and sheer mass of hulls would absorb any attack. And when this was over, the humans would be debris, and the Krelthar would go back to hunting Valthine refugees in peace. The moment the Krelthar fleet entered the debris field, the 5th Fleet opened fire from concealed positions in the battleships. Defiant and Relentless fired their main batteries, and particle beams crossed space to punch through Krelthar shields that were designed to disperse energy over time, not handle concentrated fury from weapons that were built by a species that believed in massive overkill as a tactical doctrine. And the carrier Indomitable launched her fighter wings, and hundreds of small craft swarmed the enemy formation like angry insects that stung and bit and died, but kept coming in waves that never seemed to end. The destroyers, including the vengeful spirit, focused on the escort screen and used their superior maneuverability to dart between chunks of ancient wreckage and strike from angles the Krelthar were not expecting, and Kim was in her element as she picked off targets with railguns and missiles and the occasional shot from the main gun when a particularly important target presented itself, and she worked her console with the kind of casual efficiency that came from years of training and practice until killing became as natural as breathing. The Krelthar tried to return fire, but their tight formation that had seemed like such a good idea for mutual defense became a liability because ships blocked each other's firing solutions and collided with debris that they could not maneuver around fast enough, and created a confused mess of overlapping shields and contradictory commands as different commanders tried to take control of situations that were spiraling out of their ability to manage, and Raxus realized too late that he had led his fleet into a trap that was specifically designed to turn his numerical advantage into a disadvantage. Morrison watched from his command chair as the battle unfolded exactly according to the plan he had proposed to Admiral Cole, and the Krelthar had numbers. But numbers meant nothing in a confined space where maneuverability and tactical coordination mattered more than raw firepower, and the human fleet had trained together and fought together and understood how to work as a single organism, while the Krelthar fleet was a collection of individual ships that happened to be in the same location. but were not truly coordinated in any meaningful way. He ordered Martinez to take them toward the enemy command ship, because if they could kill Raxus, the rest of the fleet would break and run like animals without a leader. And the vengeful spirit threaded through the chaos with Martinez flying like. He had been born to do this and dodging fire and debris with equal skill, and Kim locked onto the Devourer's pride and fired the main particle accelerator, and the beam struck the bridge section, and the shields held for 2 seconds before collapsing. And the beam punched through armor and kept going and carved a molten path through the interior of the ship. Raxus died without ever understanding what had hit him, and his final thought was probably disbelief that his fleet had been defeated by an enemy that was outnumbered but better trained and more aggressive and willing to take risks that no sane commander would take, except humans were not sane by galactic standards, and that made them far more dangerous than any enemy the Krelthar had ever faced before in their long history of bullying weaker species who could not fight back effectively. The destruction of the command ship caused exactly the cascade failure Morrison had predicted, and the Krelthar fleet lost cohesion immediately, and some ships tried to flee and ran into minefields that the human engineers had placed along the escape routes, and other ships tried to surrender, but got caught in friendly fire from vessels that had not received the stand-down order, and the rest fought with the desperation of cornered animals and achieved nothing except their own destruction, because desperate fighting without coordination or strategy was just suicide with extra steps. 2 hours after the battle began, it was over, and the Krelthar fleet had ceased to exist as a fighting force. And the final count was 47 ships destroyed outright, and 23 captured or disabled, and 17 that managed to escape into hyperspace, running for their lives and spreading word throughout the galaxy that attacking humans or their allies was a death sentence, and the Fifth Fleet had lost 3 destroyers and taken moderate damage across several other ships. But, compared to what they had done to the enemy, it was barely a scratch. In the aftermath, Morrison found himself in a virtual conference with Admiral Cole and Ambassador Kelris, who had been monitoring the battle from a safe distance, and Kelris said she could not believe it was over, and that the humans had actually destroyed an entire fleet, and Cole corrected her by saying they had not just destroyed the fleet but broken it so completely that the survivors would carry word back to Krelthar High Command about what happened when you attacked civilian populations and hunted refugees and committed genocide, thinking no one would stop you. Kelris thanked Morrison for saving her people and said that 25,000 Valthene were alive because he answered their distress call and was willing to fight when no one else would, and she did not know how her people could ever repay that debt. But Morrison shook his head and said there was no debt, because they had done what any decent species should do when they saw genocide happening, and that stopping it was not something that required repayment, but was just the right thing to do. And the only thing that mattered was that innocent people were safe now. Cole added that the galaxy had operated under certain assumptions for a long time about violence always being the worst option, and negotiation solving any conflict and showing restraint being the highest virtue. But sometimes evil did not negotiate, and sometimes the only way to stop a monster was to hit it so hard it never got back up. And that was what humans understood better than most species, because they had learned those lessons the hard way during their own violent history before they ever left their planet. Kelris looked at these warriors from the Death World who had just casually dismantled a fleet that had terrorized her people for months, and she thought about what it meant that humanity was now a major player on the galactic stage, and about Commander Fexen's words about unleashing an apex predator into the ecosystem, and she realized he had been right. But maybe that was not a bad thing, because the galaxy needed a species that remembered how to bare its teeth and stand up to bullies and tyrants, and not back down when the odds were against them. She asked what happened now, and Morrison explained that now they would establish patrol routes and share tactical knowledge with Federation forces, and make it clear that attacking civilian populations would result in the kind of response the Krelthar had just experienced, and the lesson learned today would spread through the galaxy, and other species would understand that humans enforced certain rules, even if it meant going to war against enemies that outnumbered them, because some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost or the odds. Cole smiled grimly and said that if anyone else decided to test humanity's resolve, they would discover what the Krelthar learned the hard way, which was that humans were from a death world and were built different, and when they said never again, they meant it with every weapon system and every tactical doctrine, and every ounce of stubborn determination, that had allowed them to survive and thrive on a planet that tried to kill them every day for millions of years. In the weeks that followed, the story of the Battle of the Debris Field spread throughout the galaxy and became legend about how a single human destroyer held off an entire fleet, and how the Fifth Fleet crushed the Krelthar in a battle that lasted only 2 hours, and other species looked at humanity with new eyes that held equal parts respect and fear, because they understood now that the Deathworlders were not just another species trying to find their place in galactic civilization, but rather a force that would reshape that civilization, whether others wanted it reshaped or not. The Krelthar never attacked another Federation species again, and the survivors of their fleet returned home with stories about the Deathworlders who fought with a ferocity that came from evolving on a planet that was classified as one of the most dangerous in known space. And those stories spread and became warnings that parents told their children about what happened when you picked fights with species that specialized in surviving impossible odds through sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit. The Valthian rebuilt the